The wrench was still in Reed Calder's hand when CEO Sloan Ashford called him a cheap mechanic in front of the entire board of directors. He didn't argue, didn't raise his voice, didn't even step back from the prototype supercar quietly leaking voltage behind him. He only said that if they started that engine, someone in that room might not walk out alive. Sloan thought he was sabotaging a $100 million launch. But as security moved toward him, billionaire Harrison Ashford walked through the door, looked at Reed's face, and went completely still. He turned to his daughter and said, "You're humiliating the man who saved my life. If you believe dignity matters more than status, stay for the truth that brought an empire to its knees." The city of Greyhaven, Michigan had spent decades building itself around one name, and that name was Ashford. Ashford Automotive occupied 60 acres of industrial land on the eastern edge of town, employing thousands of workers whose mortgages and car payments and children's college funds all ran quietly through the same corporate bloodstream. The company's latest project, a fully electric supercar called the Vesper X, was not simply a new vehicle. It was a statement, a declaration that the Ashford family could survive the future the same way they had survived every decade before it. A successful launch would unlock a near-billion-dollar investment deal that Sloan Ashford had spent 3 years negotiating, a deal that would finally let her step out of her father's considerable shadow and stand in the room as something other than Harrison Ashford's daughter. Everything, from the press access credentials to the catered board dinner, had been carefully arranged around a single evening that could not go wrong. Reed Calder arrived at the facility in a truck that had 212,000 miles on the odometer and a crack running along the lower corner of the windshield that he kept meaning to fix. He had been hired through a subcontractor to run a last-minute electrical diagnostic on the Vesper X's battery management system, a job that paid enough to cover a month of overdue rent on his garage space and put a dent in Sadie's technical school application fees. He said nothing about any of that to the Ashford employees who signed him in, because Reed did not talk about his circumstances with people who hadn't earned the right to ask. He accepted his visitor badge, pulled on his diagnostic gloves, and went to work the way he always did, quietly, methodically, and without any particular interest in impressing anyone. The main testing bay smelled of composite resin and recycled air, filled with the sound of engineers running pre-launch confirmations on equipment that cost more than Reed's garage had ever earned in a year. The Vesper X sat beneath halogen lighting like something designed to be admired from a distance, its carbon fiber body panels reflecting the faces of the technicians moving around it. Reed connected his diagnostic unit to the secondary port and began pulling raw thermal data from the battery array, because that was what the subcontractor had asked for. Within 11 minutes, he found what no one else in the building was looking for. Thermal Cluster 7 was reading internal temperatures nearly 40 degrees higher than the ambient sensors reported, which meant the onboard display was showing a false green when the actual condition was well past yellow. He recognized the part code on the thermal switch assembly the same way a person recognizes handwriting from someone who once cost them everything. It was the same component series he had flagged 2 years earlier at Northline Thermal Systems, the same design flaw that caused a heat transfer delay long enough for a cascading failure to build invisibly before the safety cutoff could respond. Reed set his scanner down, walked directly to Levi Cross, the chief engineer standing near the launch console, and said the startup sequence needed to stop. Levi looked at the official system display, which showed no anomalies, and then looked at Reed with the particular expression reserved for people who show up from outside and think they understand the room. He said the vehicle had passed every certification protocol and that the board was arriving in 40 minutes. Reed said the display was lying. Owen Kessler appeared before Levi could respond, moving across the floor with the unhurried pace of someone who had learned long ago that authority didn't require speed. He told Reed, in a voice that was almost pleasant, that subcontract personnel were not authorized to make operational decisions, and that his job was to file a report through the appropriate channel, not to speak directly to senior engineering staff. Kessler looked at Reed for exactly 1 second longer than necessary, and in that second something passed behind his eyes. A flicker of recognition he immediately buried under a layer of professional composure. He had known Reed Calder's name for 2 years, and he had worked very hard to make sure Reed Calder would never matter inside these walls. Reed did not argue with Kessler. He walked to the battery safety panel on the south wall of the bay, opened the cover with a key that was still on his certification ring, and pulled the primary disconnect for the Vesper X's charging circuit. Every status light on the launch console went dark at once. The room went quiet in the particular way rooms go quiet when something irreversible has just happened. Levi Cross stared at the dead panel. 2 technicians stood up from their stations, and Kessler's expression did not change, but his jaw tightened by a fraction, and the almost pleasantness drained entirely out of his voice when he turned toward Reed and said that pulling that connector was going to have consequences. Reed looked at the thermal readout on his personal scanner, still climbing on Cluster 7, and said the consequences of not pulling it would have been worse. He was still standing at the panel when the boardroom door opened and Sloan Ashford walked through. Sloan had been awake since 4 in the morning, running through presentation variables and investor talking points and the particular kind of mental arithmetic that comes with knowing your professional reputation and your company's survival are balanced on the same narrow ledge. She was 34 years old, and she had earned her position through a combination of genuine intelligence and relentless work. But she also knew that a significant portion of the room would always see her as the founder's daughter first and the CEO second. And she had learned to respond to that by being harder, faster, and less forgiving of error than anyone around her expected. She saw a man in a grease-stained work uniform standing at a disconnected safety panel. She saw a prototype worth millions of dollars sitting dark and silent on a launch floor. And she received the information Kessler offered in the 30 seconds before she reached the center of the bay. An outside contractor had pulled the primary disconnect without authorization. She asked Reed directly, in front of the gathered board members and investors who had filtered in behind her, whether he understood what he had just cost this company. Her voice was controlled, clipped, carrying the precision of someone trained to project authority in rooms full of people looking for weakness. Reed did not raise his voice in return. He said money couldn't bring someone back once they were gone, and then he asked her to check the actual temperature inside Battery Cluster 7 rather than reading the dashboard figure, because those were 2 different numbers and she was currently looking at the wrong one. Kessler stepped in before she could respond, telling the room that the subcontractor had a history of disrupting projects and that his garage was currently carrying significant debt, which in the world of implication was enough to suggest that a man looking for leverage might manufacture a crisis to create one. The information landed the way Kessler intended. People in that room understood financial desperation as a motive in a way they could not quickly understand battery thermal dynamics, and the shift in the atmosphere was visible to anyone paying attention. Sloan looked at the work boots, the worn tools, the faded embroidery on the uniform chest, and she made the calculation that people in her position make constantly, and usually without realizing it. She measured the source against the message and found the source unconvincing. She said, in front of every person in that room, that she didn't know what Reed thought he was going to accomplish by walking into a facility that didn't belong to him and dismantling equipment he didn't understand, but that his attempt to position himself as important in a room he had no business being in was finished. She used the phrase cheap mechanic, with the casual precision of someone who had grown up in a world where that phrase meant something specific. She nodded to the security team. Reed picked up his scanner. He didn't argue, didn't raise his voice, and didn't look at the faces of the people watching him. He did, for one moment, look at the Vesper X, and the expression on his face was not anger or humiliation, but something closer to resignation. The expression of a man who has been through this exact sequence before and knows exactly how it ends. He was halfway to the exit when the main doors opened again, and Harrison Ashford walked in, because Harrison had insisted on being present for the final pre-launch check, no matter what the press schedule said. The older man scanned the room with the practiced calm of someone accustomed to reading situations quickly, and his gaze moved past Kessler, past Sloan, past the dark console, and landed on Reed. Harrison Ashford went completely still. The color did not exactly leave his face, but something happened in his expression. A recognition that moved through him like a current and brought everything in him to a stop. He crossed the room, stood in front of Reed Calder, and asked one question. Had this man been on Blackridge Pass on a night 2 winters ago when the snow was coming in sideways off the lake? Reed looked at him for a long moment and said nothing. The silence was its own answer. Harrison turned to face his daughter in the room, and his voice when he spoke was quiet, but carried the kind of weight that makes large spaces feel small. He said his daughter was humiliating the man who had saved his life, and that if Reed Calder had not stopped his car on that road 2 years ago, Harrison would not have been alive to build the company she was now running. The room held its breath. Reed looked at the prototype behind them and said, in the same tone he had used for everything else, that the accident on Blackridge Pass was about to repeat itself. 2 winters prior, on a Thursday night in late January when Greyhaven was being hammered by the first major snowstorm of the year, Harrison Ashford had driven himself out to a restricted stretch of state road to test the earliest prototype of what would eventually become the Vesper X program. He had done it without telling anyone, because Harrison had always believed that the most honest evaluation of a vehicle came from driving it alone, without engineers watching for reactions or publicists calculating optics. The road was empty, the visibility was poor, and the car performed beautifully for the first 40 minutes in conditions that would have stopped most vehicles from leaving the parking structure. Then, without a single warning light or audible alert, the car stopped. The thermal switch in the battery array had been operating at near failure threshold for the previous 8 miles, held in a false stable state by a sensor that reported coolant flow it was no longer receiving. When the switch finally locked, it locked in the wrong position, blocking the heat exchange path entirely rather than defaulting to the safe cutoff mode it had been designed for. The battery temperature climbed through dangerous thresholds. In under 3 minutes, the vehicle's electrical system went completely dark, and the door locks, which were electronically controlled, would not respond. Harrison pulled at a handle that would not move, in a car filling with smoke, on a road where no one knew he was, in conditions where no one would reasonably stop. Reed Calder had been driving back from a parts supplier when his headlights swept across a car sliding on the ice at a curve he had driven past 100 times. He had been going to the hospital. His wife, Clara, was at Mercy General in her final hours, and he had received the call from her nurse while he was loading the last of the parts. And the drive back had been one of those stretches of road where a person runs through time calculations they can barely afford to make. He saw the car leave the shoulder and stopped, because stopping was not a choice he made. It was simply what he did. He had tools in the back of his truck and enough working knowledge of early electric vehicle architecture to identify the emergency mechanical override on the door frame, and he used both things in the right order and got Harrison out of the vehicle approximately 90 seconds before the battery pack ignited. Harrison had seen his face. He had tried to speak and couldn't. By the time the first responders arrived 20 minutes later, Reed was already back on the highway. Because he had looked at his phone, and the last message from the hospital nurse had been sent 47 minutes ago. He arrived at Mercy General at 11:42. Clara Calder had died at 11:39. Reed sat in the hospital parking lot for a long time before going inside, and he never told anyone what had happened on Blackridge Pass because there was nothing to tell that didn't end with the same 3 minutes he could not take back. Harrison recovered from smoke inhalation and 2 cracked ribs and spent 6 weeks demanding that his staff identify the person who had saved him. The internal incident report listed the rescuer as an unidentified motorist. No name, no contact information, no vehicle record that survived the investigation. Kessler had handled the post-incident documentation personally, and Kessler had known exactly whose name to leave out. Standing now in the testing bay of his own company, Harrison looked at Reed Calder and understood that the debt he had been carrying for 2 years had been owed to a man who had never once come to collect it. Reed, when Harrison asked why he had never reached out, said only that saving someone was not an invoice he intended to submit for payment. Sloane heard those words and felt something shift in how she understood the previous hour, but she was not yet ready to say what it meant. She looked at the part code on Reed's scanner and asked how certain he was about the connection. And he told her the components in both vehicles were not merely similar but from the same manufacturing lot, marked for destruction 2 years ago. Harrison said nothing further. He simply turned to the room and said the launch would not proceed until the vehicle had been cleared by an independent review. Kessler looked at his watch, then at the board members, and said that was not a decision Harrison was authorized to make under the current management structure. The emergency board session lasted 2 hours and produced the kind of institutional paralysis that large organizations generate when money and safety point in opposite directions. The investment agreement contained a delivery clause. Delay the launch by more than 72 hours, and the funding terms could be renegotiated from scratch, a process that would take months the company did not have and might result in terms that made the original deal look generous. Kessler arrived with a prepared summary showing the Vesper X had passed 47 individual safety certifications, that the thermal management system had been independently tested by 3 accredited labs, and that the part code Reed had identified was a standard industry number used across multiple component families, not a unique identifier for a specific failed batch. He presented all of this smoothly, in the measured tone of a man who had been preparing for exactly this moment, and several board members found it persuasive. Kessler also mentioned, as if in passing, that Reed Calder had been terminated from Northline Thermal Systems under disputed circumstances, that Northline had been the primary thermal component supplier for the vehicle involved in Harrison's accident, and that an employee dismissed from a supplier shortly before a major failure might have motivations for appearing 2 years later at the company damaged by that failure. He did not use the word extortion. He didn't need to. The implication floated through the room on its own and attached itself to Reed, the way implications always attach themselves to people wearing the wrong uniform in the wrong building. Harrison wanted to believe the man standing at the back of the room, but Harrison's certainty was personal, and the board required technical evidence, and the technical evidence in the room currently favored Kessler. Sloane watched her father's face and understood that he was struggling against the same gap she was. The gap between what felt true and what could be proven to a room full of people who needed documents rather than instinct. She made a decision that surprised her as she was making it. She approached Reed quietly, away from the main group, and told him she was prepared to offer him a substantial settlement in exchange for his discretion until an internal investigation could be completed, framing it as an opportunity that would preserve his dignity while the company handled the matter properly. Reed looked at her for a moment without saying anything, then said that if he took the money, every word he had said in the last 3 hours would become a transaction, and it would mean Kessler had been right about him from the beginning. He said he wanted 3 things instead of the money: access to the raw thermal data from the Vesper X, access to the incident file from the Black Ridge Pass accident, and the approval chain for the component lot that had been in both vehicles. Sloan studied him for a long moment, running the calculation she always ran. What did this person want? What were they willing to risk? And what did that tell her about who they were? She gave Reed 36 hours. She said if he could not produce evidence sufficient to support his claims by the time the rescheduled launch window opened, she would proceed with the event and pursue legal action against him for the operational disruption he had caused. She said it without pleasure, only as the boundary she was capable of holding. Reed accepted, not because 36 hours was generous, but because it was enough to find what he already knew was there if the records still existed. He sat down at the workstation Sloan had authorized and entered his credentials into the company's incident archive. The folder for the Black Ridge Pass event opened to a single line, "File not found." Every document, every photograph, every data log from that night had been deleted from the corporate system, not archived, not restricted, simply deleted. The testing lab after midnight had the particular silence of a large building where most people have gone home, but the work refuses to stop. Sloan stayed because she couldn't make herself leave, pacing the perimeter of the room in the way she paced when something in her thinking hadn't settled into place yet, stopping occasionally to watch Reed work at the diagnostic station with the focused economy of someone who has long since separated what matters from what doesn't. She had expected to spend these hours confirming a mistake she could quietly walk back. Instead, she found herself revising the model she had built of this situation, one data point at a time. Reed reconstructed the thermal failure sequence using the Vesper X's raw sensor feed, rather than the processed output that went to the dashboard display, a distinction that turned out to be significant. The processed output ran through a software layer that averaged readings across clusters and smoothed anomalies falling within a defined tolerance band, which meant the display showed comfort where the raw data showed stress. He demonstrated this by applying a controlled thermal load to cluster 7 using external resistors, low enough to stay below the threshold that would trigger any automated safety response, and then running both feeds side by side on the same screen. The dashboard showed green. The raw feed showed a temperature curve that matched the first 3 stages of the Black Ridge Pass failure profile with statistical precision that was not a coincidence. Levi Cross ran an independent confirmation using the testing lab's dedicated hardware and confirmed the results, then looked at Sloan and said quietly that the vehicle should not launch in its current state. It was Sloan who pulled Reed's employment record from the Northline archive through a third-party vendor portal that still held the old data. Not because she thought it would help her argue against him, but because she had realized she didn't actually know who she was dealing with. What she found was a senior diagnostic engineer rated the top technical performer in his division for 4 consecutive years, whose only disciplinary record was a single letter of reprimand issued 3 days after he submitted a formal rejection report on a thermal component batch, and whose separation paperwork listed the reason for termination as workforce restructuring. The letter acknowledging receipt of Reed's report was signed by Owen Kessler, who had been Northline's primary procurement liaison for Ashford Automotive at the time. Sloan read through the timeline twice and then set the file down on the bench between them. She asked Reed why he hadn't filed a legal challenge, and he explained it without bitterness, in the flat tone of someone describing a chapter of their life that is finished. Kessler had sent word through a third party that any legal action would be met with a coordinated effort to place Reed's name on every unverifiable quality vendor list in the industry, effectively ending his ability to work in his field. When Clara's diagnosis came 6 months after the termination, Reed had made the calculation that his time and his money and his energy had exactly one viable destination, and he had put all three there and not looked back. Sloan sat with that information for a long time, understanding that the system her family had built had ground this man down to his last resources because he had refused to lie on a report. Marin Price called at 2:17 in the morning with a finding that pushed everything else aside. She had located a transfer order for the flagged component batch, signed 18 months ago, moving 4,000 units from a disposal queue into a secondary storage warehouse under a vendor identification number that appeared in none of Ashford Automotive's public procurement records. The signature on the transfer order was Owen Kessler's. Sloan looked at the document on Maran's screen for a long time without speaking, and when she did speak, it was only to ask how quickly they could confirm a chain of custody. Reed was already pulling up the secondary warehouse manifests to check which components had moved from that inventory into the Vesper X supply chain. The story broke at 6:43 in the morning on a regional business wire, and it had clearly been placed by someone who wanted it to land before the business day began. A mechanic named Reed Calder, recently hired as a subtractor for Ashford for Automotive's launch event, was alleged to have accepted $250,000 from a shell company with documented ties to Ashford's primary domestic competitor in exchange for disrupting the Vesper X reveal. The story included a bank transaction record showing a deposit to an account in Reed's name, timestamped the previous afternoon, and a quote from an unnamed source describing him as a terminated former supplier employee with a history of antagonistic behavior. It was thorough, specific, and almost entirely fabricated. Kessler moved quickly. He distributed the story to 3 board members before Sloan had finished reading it, framing it as vindication of his position from the previous evening, and evidence that Reed's entire intervention had been strategic rather than principled. The subcontractor firm that had hired Reed for the job sent a termination notice by 9 in the morning, and by noon, 2 of his regular customers had called the garage to say they were pulling their vehicles because they didn't want their names connected to a public dispute. The garage's appointment calendar, already thin, began to look like something that could not survive another month. Sadie called her father at 10:30. She had seen his name on the morning broadcast at her school and wanted to know if he was all right, and her voice had that particular blend of worry and composure that comes from spending years as the steady presence in a household held together by one exhausted person. Reed told her he was fine, that the situation was being worked out, and that she needed to keep her attention on the entrance exam she had coming up in 3 weeks. He did not tell her about the appointment cancellations or the termination notice or the amount of money he did not have to fight a coordinated public campaign. He said he loved her and hung up and went back to the problem. Harrison believed Reed without reservation, but members of the executive committee formally requested that Harrison recuse himself from any decisions involving Reed on the grounds that his personal history with the man made objective judgment impossible, and Harrison understood that his credibility in this moment was doing Reed more harm than good. Sloan examined the transaction record with Marin for an hour and identified 2 things that did not survive scrutiny. The company listed as the source of the deposit had been registered at a commercial mail service address that was dissolved 14 months ago and the timestamp on the transaction predated Reed's arrival at the Ashford facility by approximately 4 hours. The money had theoretically been sent before the event Reed was supposedly paid to disrupt had even begun. Neither detail had made it into the published story. Sloane went to the testing wing to tell Reed what she had found, and when she got there, she discovered his access card sitting on the workbench next to a neatly folded visitor lanyard. She found him in the facility parking lot, loading his diagnostic cases into the back of his truck in the gray morning light. She asked him to come back inside, and he turned to look at her with an expression that was not angry but entirely clear, and he told her that she had been given the same evidence he had been given, and the first time it became inconvenient she had looked at his clothes and made the same judgment she had made in the boardroom. He said he had nothing left to prove to anyone in that building, and nothing left that this situation could take from him that it hadn't already cost him 2 years ago. He closed the tailgate and walked toward the driver's side, and Sloane stood in the parking lot understanding that what Kessler had been trying to accomplish had just worked, not because the evidence had convinced her, but because she had let it reach her long enough to show on her face. She went to the garage the following morning without her assistant, without security, without a prepared statement or a communications strategy. She drove herself in a car she almost never drove to a part of Greyhaven she had never been to, and she parked in front of a building with a faded sign that read Calder Automotive and sat in the car for a full minute before getting out. Reed was in the service bay, not working on a vehicle but doing the quieter, heavier work of unbolting the sign bracket from the exterior wall. He did not appear surprised to see her. He set down the socket wrench and waited. Sloane said she was not there as a CEO. She said she had come because there was no version of what had happened in the previous 48 hours that reflected well on her, and she had been raised to understand that accountability without an audience was the only kind that meant anything. She told him plainly that she had publicly called him cheap and dishonest and replaceable in a room full of people she had spent years trying to impress, and that when he had provided her with hours of evidence supporting every claim he had made, she had let one planted news story shake what she thought she knew about him. She said she was sorry, not as a liability management strategy, not as the opening move in a negotiation, but as a person who had done something that could not be justified by the pressure she had been under. Reed listened to all of it. He did not tell her she was forgiven, and he did not tell her the apology didn't matter. He said an apology could not return the customers who had canceled, could not unring the bell of a public accusation in a small city where everyone knew his name, could not give him back the years he had spent being quietly destroyed by a system that had never once considered the cost to him. He said it without heat, stating it the way a person states facts that are simply true. Sloane nodded and did not try to qualify any of it. She asked about the night on Blackridge Pass because she had realized she only knew the outline and not the interior. Reed was quiet for a moment, and then he told her he had been on his way to Mercy General. He had been 20 minutes away when he stopped. He had gotten back in his truck and driven to the hospital and arrived at 11:42, and Clara had been gone for 3 minutes. He had never told Harrison any part of this, because a man who carries the knowledge that someone missed a final moment because of him is carrying something that doesn't have good places to set it down, and Reed had not seen any reason to hand Harrison that weight. Sloane asked whether he regretted stopping. Reed said he regretted that he had not been able to be in 2 places at once. He said he did not regret that her father was alive. The silence after that lasted long enough to be significant, and Sloane had spent her career surrounded by people who were always calculating, always positioning, always measuring their words for effect, and the man standing in front of her had just described the worst night of his life, with the same absence of performance he brought to everything else. She took out her phone and showed him Marin's analysis, the non-existent company, the timestamps that preceded his arrival, the chain of custody on the component transfer order bearing Kessler's signature. She said she needed him back inside the facility, not as a contractor or an employee, but as an independent technical authority with the standing to stop the project if he found it necessary. She said the board had voted to proceed under Kessler's direction, and that the window was now less than 18 hours. Reed studied the timestamp on the transaction document for a long moment and agreed to come back on one condition. If the vehicle was not safe, Sloan would cancel the launch herself, in public, in front of every investor and press contact she had spent 3 years cultivating, regardless of the financial consequences. She looked at him and said yes without hesitating. Marin called, before they had reached the parking lot, to report that the board had voted to temporarily suspend Sloan's operational authority over the launch event. Kessler had the room and the schedule, and the event was moving forward. Harrison's personal archive occupied a back room of the house he kept outside the city. Plain metal shelving, cardboard banker's boxes labeled in his own handwriting, a filing system built around the principle that the most important documents were the ones nobody else knew existed. He had kept every piece of paper connected to the Black Ridge Pass incident in a box he had never given to anyone, because the investigation's official closure had always felt wrong and he had not trusted himself to let it go. The 5 of them gathered around a folding table in that room: Harrison, Sloan, Reed, Marin, and Levi, while the clock moved steadily toward a launch that was now less than 7 hours away. Harrison found it in the 3rd box. A sealed evidence bag containing a data retrieval module that a first responder had removed from the prototype's secondary data port before the vehicle was towed, following standard incident documentation protocol. The module had been passed along to Harrison's personal physician during his hospital stay as a personal effect rather than an official record, and had never been entered into the corporate evidence chain. This meant Kessler had never known it existed. Reed identified the module type, connected it to a legacy interface unit from Harrison's equipment shelf, and the data that came back was partial but sufficient. 9 minutes of pre-incident sensor logs showing the thermal monitoring system had generated 7 distinct overheat warnings in the battery array. Warnings that had been received, acknowledged, and suppressed by an administrative override logged under a service account carrying Kessler's access credentials. The suppression command had been entered 11 minutes before Harrison started the vehicle for his test drive. It had disabled the automatic cutoff that should have shut the car down safely at a temperature threshold far below the point at which the battery pack ignited, which meant someone had known the car was dangerous before Harrison got in and had deliberately made it more dangerous. The same service account had been used 8 months after the accident to authorize the transfer of 4,000 thermal switch units from the disposal facility into an active inventory warehouse. Units that should have been destroyed after the investigation flagged the design flaw. And from that warehouse a portion had entered the Vesper X supply chain through a purchasing order that bypassed standard vendor verification. The trail was complete and every link in it ended at the same name. Marin confirmed that the data module carried legal standing because it had remained in unbroken custody from the first responder's signature to Harrison's personal possession, never entering the corporate system where it could have been altered. This was sufficient to initiate a formal regulatory investigation, but it was not sufficient to stop a launch that was now less than 6 hours away, because Kessler had already moved the event timeline forward by 2 hours, and the security perimeter around the venue was being managed by his direct team. Sloan's corporate credentials had been suspended. She could not issue a stop order that would be honored. But she remained a significant direct shareholder, which meant she had the right to be physically present at any public event held in the company's name. Reed identified the specific hazard on the venue technical diagram. If Kessler activated the vehicle's drive mode before the demonstration stage while the car was in the enclosed staging area, the thermal sequence would build with no safe discharge path and several thousand people on 3 sides of the structure. He said there was one manual intervention point that existed entirely outside software control. A mechanical power distribution panel accessible from beneath the stage floor, and he said it in the tone of someone who had already decided what he was going to do about it. On the borrowed laptop running the facility's live technical feed, the Vesper X's ignition sequence had already begun. The event venue was a converted exhibition hall 2 miles from the main facility, and the crowd inside it represented the sum of everything Ashford Automotive had spent 3 years building toward. Journalists, institutional investors, industry analysts, and the camera systems that would carry the images to every outlet that covered the sector. Kessler stood at the podium with the practiced confidence of a man who had spent the previous 12 hours converting a near disaster into a demonstration of institutional resilience, telling the assembled room that the rumors circulating about the Vesper X were the product of a calculated effort by a disgruntled former subcontractor and that the company's commitment to safety had never wavered. He delivered it smoothly and without visible strain, and the room received it with the attentiveness of people who had paid good money to believe something. Reed moved through the service corridor beneath the stage while Kessler was speaking, navigating by the facility diagram he had memorized from the technical packet 36 hours earlier. The space smelled of concrete dust and electrical conduit, and the metallic warmth of large equipment at working temperature, and the portable display in his hand showed Cluster 7's temperature not yet in the critical band, but moving toward it with the regularity of a system following a pattern it had followed before. He located the mechanical power distribution panel behind a service access cover 12 feet from the stage center line, the one physical interruption point in the Vesper X's charging circuit that existed entirely outside the vehicle's software architecture, which meant it could not be overridden remotely and could not be locked out by any administrator with Kessler's level of access. Sloan was in the main room with Harrison and Marin and a company attorney whose presence Marin had arranged, standing near the back of the audience, watching Kessler at the podium with the documents in her hands that she intended to present to a regulatory official the moment the event could be safely stopped. She had sent a formal, written demand to the event coordinator to halt the demonstration pending safety verification, and the coordinator had declined on the grounds that operational decisions for the event had been authorized through Kessler's office. Kessler saw her from the stage, paused for exactly 1 second, and then activated the demonstration sequence from the podium controller. The Vesper X's drive systems came fully online, the interior lighting illuminated in sequence, and the car began a slow programmed roll toward the exit ramp. Levi Cross was at the secondary monitoring station backstage. He engaged the physical safety interlock on the car's drive axle, a mechanical brake system installed on all prototype vehicles that required manual release and could not be overridden remotely, and the car stopped. The crowd murmured with the uncertainty of people who couldn't tell whether what they were seeing was planned. Levi directed the technical team to push the raw sensor feed to the main overhead screen rather than the process dashboard output, and the numbers that appeared were not the numbers that had been promised to anyone in the room. Reed opened the panel, identified the correct circuit, and pulled the connector. The Vesper X's charging system disconnected with a soft click that was audible to no one except Reed, and the temperature in Cluster 7 leveled off and began to fall. The car was safe because two people had done two specific physical things in the right order at the right moment, which was, Reed understood, exactly how engineering was supposed to work. Not through authority or hierarchy or political maneuvering, but through someone who knew what to do and did it. Sloan walked to the stage without waiting for a microphone, stood in front of the Vesper X, and told the room that the launch was canceled, that the vehicle had a documented safety defect that had been actively concealed, and that she was personally assuming responsibility for the failure of leadership that had allowed that concealment to proceed this far. She said it clearly and without preparation, and without looking once at anyone who might have told her to stop. Marin handed the evidence package to the company attorney, who acknowledged formal receipt in front of witnesses. Kessler said Sloan was destroying the legacy her father had spent a lifetime building. Harrison stood up in the back of the room and said the Ashford legacy had survived 6 decades, because the company had always been willing to pay the cost of doing the right thing even when the right thing was expensive, and that Reed Calder had demonstrated that principle more faithfully than anyone currently on the company's payroll. He said Reed had done it at enormous personal cost and without ever asking for recognition, and that the board would do well to remember what kind of person that was before deciding what they thought of him. The vote to formally suspend Kessler pending investigation was not close. The investigation that followed was methodical and did not produce any revelations beyond the ones already documented, because the documentation was thorough enough that drama was not required. Kessler was placed on administrative suspension within 48 hours, referred to the company's regulatory compliance team, and subsequently to external counsel, and removed from every active project. The story of what he had done, suppressing safety warnings, falsifying documentation, recycling condemned components, and orchestrating a smear campaign against the person who had caught him, did not require embellishment. The facts arranged themselves into a sequence that investigators, regulators, and the public found straightforward to follow, because the most effective kind of cover-up is the kind that leaves no room for alternative interpretations once the first document surfaces. Ashford Automotive issued a voluntary recall on every vehicle and fleet component incorporating the thermal switch batch, absorbing a financial impact that ran into 8 figures and prompted exactly the kind of investor concern that Sloan had spent years trying to prevent. She held a press conference at which she read a prepared statement, deviated from it almost immediately, and ended up speaking for 11 minutes without notes. She used Reed Calder's full name 3 times, described his professional history with specificity and without hedging, and said publicly that she had stood in a room full of powerful people and chosen to believe the man with the most institutional authority over the man with the most actual knowledge, and that the difference between those two things was something she intended to make structural rather than personal. She met individually with the assembly line workers who had filed and ignored safety concerns over the preceding 2 years, not to offer settlements, but to establish a formal protocol. Any employee at any level had the authority to initiate a production halt on documented safety grounds. The decision would be reviewed by an independent technical committee within 24 hours, and no adverse employment action could be taken against anyone who exercised that right. Harrison called Reed to discuss what form an appropriate acknowledgement might take, because Harrison was a man who understood that some debts cannot be settled, but that letting them stand unaddressed is its own kind of failure. Reed said he didn't want a number. He said there was a technical scholarship program he had been thinking about for several years, one that would support students entering mechanical and electrical engineering programs from working-class backgrounds, and that if the Ashford family wanted to make something meaningful out of what had happened, that was the direction he would point them toward. The program was established within 90 days, endowed at a level that would sustain it for a generation, and named for Clara Calder. Sloan offered Reed the position of Vice President of Engineering. He declined with the same unhurried certainty with which he declined everything he had already decided wasn't right for him, and they negotiated over 2 conversations to an arrangement that suited both. Independent Director of Engineering Safety, reporting to the board rather than the executive team, with unilateral authority to pause any project at any stage for documented safety reasons, and no approval required from anyone in between. Sloan asked whether he could forgive her. Reed said forgiveness was not a statement but a practice, and that it was something she would have to demonstrate through how she led from that day forward. Sloan extended her hand. Reed shook it. Not with the careful courtesy he had used the morning she signed his visitor badge, but as one equal to another. 6 months after the cancelled launch, the Vesper X returned, not to a stage designed for spectacle but to a flat lot behind the main facility on a clear morning in early October, with the workers and engineers who had built it standing in the front row because Sloan had arranged the seating that way. The thermal management system had been redesigned from the battery cell level upward, every component sourced and verified through a process Reed had helped write, and the car rolled out quietly and without incident, which was precisely the point. No announcement, no dramatic reveal, only a vehicle doing what it was built to do, in front of the people who had built it. The Calder garage still operated out of the same building on the same block in Greyhaven, now also functioning as an apprenticeship workshop for the first cohort of Clara Calder Scholarship recipients, students who arrived 3 afternoons a week to learn diagnostics from a man who taught by showing rather than explaining. Sadie attended the scholarship announcement in the courtyard of her technical school and stood near the edge of the gathering, while her father stood even further from the cameras, which was where he always stood. She had inherited his way of occupying space, taking only what was necessary, leaving room for everyone else. Harrison watched the Vesper X complete its first clean test run and told Reed that the man had saved his life twice over. Reed said the first time he had saved 1 person. He said this time, all of them together had saved something that mattered to a great many more. The distinction was the one Harrison had been thinking about for 6 months without finding the right words for it, and hearing Reed say it simply and without ceremony was the kind of thing that stays with a person. Sloan stood beside Reed on the concrete lot that morning, in the front row with the people who built things, no distance remaining between the suit and the grease-stained uniform. Only the work, and the wrench that had been in Reed Calder's hand from the beginning, still doing what it had always done, setting right what power had broken.